right?
Right.
Hi, remote folks, can you hear us?
And it basically, don't reinstall like update, right?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Happens, so you've done the update.
Oh, we can't hear you. Hold on just a moment. Let's,
I can hear you now.
Wait.
I see you're on cellular. Do you want to wait till you're on Wi-Fi?
How about now?
Hear my mail.
We can hear you.
Is that the right speakers?
Nope. All right, can we hear you now, remote people?
Testing, testing.
Lovely, thank you so much. We're going to wait just a few minutes. We still have people streaming into the room.
Oh, it's not good.
started. Hello, remote people. Can you hear us still?
Yes.
Meeting.
Right. It's an attack vector.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like orange sheet, regular set.
So we spent 2 days having some good preliminary discussions, and I think we have promising ways forward for all of our major deliverables, which is fantastic. And I think the next steps we need to take, obviously, are to make those more concrete. Chairs will, we've created a GitHub repo for the drafts. We'll start creating issues there to track the discussions we've had here to make sure that we have we're tracking the state of all the important points we need to cover. We hope to, as we've discussed, we hope to see a number of proposals to address those issues, and we can start discussing those in the mailing list. But to meet our milestones in the charter, which I think we have agreement are important to meet if at all possible. I think it's very likely we're going to need to meet at least one more time and possibly more than that. And so on a compressed time scale like this, scheduling the meetings is always fraught. In the IETF, we can have interim meetings like this one, where it's hybrid. There are both online folks and face-to-face folks. And often, especially at the beginning, these face-to-face discussions are very useful for building consensus, conveying information, getting the subtle details, and especially the hallway conversations to build relationships that you can leverage to make sure that we're all moving in roughly the same direction. But we also have hybrid, online-only meetings, virtual meetings. So we can hold a meeting with less constraints around where it is and notice periods and everything, where it's all on MeetEcho, this fabulous tool you see behind me. And I'm suspecting that we probably are going to want to have a virtual meeting sometime in around the May timeframe. That would allow us to give people a chance to go out, write proposals, have some initial discussions in the mailing lists, and then we can have a virtual interim to go into more depth. If we hold a virtual interim, I don't think we'll have all-day sessions, both because that's going to be extremely unfair to some people in some time zones. So we'll probably have 2 or perhaps 3 days of 2 or 3 hour sessions along that line. But we'll figure out the details later on. But just flagging that that's something that we want to do.
Notes.
Oh yes, the notes.
Ted is starting taking notes. Can you do it from now, Ted?
I think it should be easier today.
You always say that.
Famous last words.
I'm optimistic. What can I say? But I think it because again of our compressed time scale, holding another hybrid interim is something that would probably be beneficial if we want to try and meet our milestones. And so we've been talking about holding one in the July timeframe. And when we started this work, there was a notion that we would bounce back and forth between the prominent jurisdictions for relevant regulation, the US and Europe. Things have changed. So we're now thinking that it might be sensible to hold an interim in London, both because there's interest from some stakeholders there, and also because it's very convenient for people to get to, and also because it's extremely convenient for me to schedule it there because I have a facility that's perfect for this. And so that the whole finding a venue question goes away, which is actually a major part of scheduling these things. And so the issue then becomes timing. I've talked to a couple of people informally, and it seems like the week of July the 14th is convenient for some at least. That is, however, the week before the IETF meeting in Madrid, which means that if you're traveling to Madrid, you'd need to extend that travel to be there a little bit earlier. Of the folks that I've talked to, they'd prefer to do that rather than making that trip even a week longer for a meeting that was before that. But the ISG has a policy that we don't schedule meetings directly before or after the major IETF meetings. So we have gone and talked to the air director, we've talked to the IETF chair. The ISG has an informal meeting today, and they're going to discuss this to see if we can get an exception to hold that meeting in that week. we should hopefully be able to get back to you on the mailing list within a day or two, if that's possible. And I think what we'll do is we'll send out a poll to the group to see when people are available to assure that that's the right time to hold that meeting. Right now, we're looking at, the options are either July 17 or 18, or 14 or 15, or 10 or 11. Yes, go ahead.
So, two things, the SPCA, which I'm very active in,
Mhm.
video people, are actually meeting in Madrid at the same IETF venue
Mhm.
the week before. So those dates you said are the SPCA meeting in.
Right, so we would lose you for that
You would
week.
lose me.
Okay.
I'm wondering, is it possible if somebody could find meeting space in Madrid, if we could just meet in Madrid that week, so that I could bounce, but also people would actually meet, and then it would be easy, because
If you're offering space, feel free.
we'll have to explore, like, I mean,
We don't have budget, let me put it that way.
well, no, but I'm wondering, we might, has the question been asked of the secretary or the LLC, if we already might have space that would be available?
I've asked that question many times in the past, and the answer is always no, because you're asking for a substantial room for a substantial amount of time. And they budget, very closely. They're not gonna have a room sitting around for 2 days.
I can check with Microsoft to see if we've got, only because also the following week is something that
Right.
Microsoft needs.
If someone else has a space in Madrid, please look into that. We also have space, Cloudflare also has space in Lisbon that I can look into. I know Ted's happy with that.
I'm happy to show people around.
Right, so we can do that. Sorry?
Ericsson has an office in Madrid.
In Madrid, if you could look into that'd be great. If we have multiple options, the only thing I'll say is we generally prefer to rotate through hosts rather than having the same entity host each meeting, just the optics of that are not great. So yeah.
Does it really make sense? I mean, we can just meet at the IETF meeting and ask for 2 or 3.
No, that's.
That's 2 or 3 2-hour slots. That's the problem. But we need 2 or 3 days, I think.
So we need 2 days, and then have a slot for the activity, and then cover us, do you think?
Usually one slot, like, at the IETF meeting. The idea of having this stuff before,
Sure.
like, kind of leave.
So we're looking for, to be clarified, we're looking for 2 days or 2.5 days of meeting space.
I'd say probably 2 days of meeting space the week before, yeah. Assuming that the ISG approves that. If we don't do that, and what I wanted to really, we don't know we're gonna be able to meet the week before. We're hoping we can, because we think that's our best option right now. And of course, this will be in Europe. If we can do it, if someone offers space in Madrid and we kind of, the stakeholders think that's a good idea. I mean, I'm very aware that some people, travel is an issue, and how you arrange your travel is gonna be different for everyone. We can look at Madrid, we can look at London, we can look at Lisbon. I think those are the 3 obvious choices. And if somebody has a facility in Paris, that's probably workable, or Geneva, Wow, that was a face.
Paris.
Yeah, not Paris? Okay. This is the height of the summer in Europe, and that's another part of the problem.
When you use the phrase, we don't have budget, and you use the word Geneva right after it, it's a funny combination.
Right.
But Madrid, I'll just put the J, if we can find a space in Madrid, it does make sense for an ITF working for the ITF
Sure.
being the next, just.
I would just caution, like anything later, then the IETF meeting will fall smack in the middle of European summer vacations.
Absolutely. That's why we're talking about before, or one of the reasons we're talking about before. So the other option is if we can't meet that week before the IETF, it would be the week before that. So probably July 10, 11. And I wanted to get a sense of the room and the folks online, if that would be workable. Again, in Europe, either London or probably London, because it's a little more spaced out from Madrid, so it doesn't make as much sense. And it's a little more central for people to fly to. I'm seeing yes. I'm seeing probably no from Martin. Other folks?
All, yeah.
So the IETF meeting is the week of the 14th of July.
The ITF meeting is the week of the 21st.
It goes from the
It's 19 to 25.
19th.
I have a question for you. When is your draft cutoff date?
It's 1 week before the ITF meeting.
So if we have a meeting in maybe just week before the IT meeting, I think it doesn't lead to the draft cut.
We can handle that.
Yeah.
There are ways. And I guess I'm primarily, I think for the folks who don't intend to go, Gentlemen? For the folks who are not going to the or planning to go to the IETF meeting because they're not engaged in the IETF and they can't justify spending the money and the travel to go for a 2-hour meeting or whatever, this may be just whether you have a conflict or not for that week, for the week that we choose. For the people who are going to the IETF meeting, it's a question of whether you want to go 1 week to one meeting and then another week to another meeting, or have more space between them. And so that's the feedback that I think we're looking for here. Not to diminish the value of the input from the folks who aren't going to the IETF meeting.
I think if we meet in Madrid, it should be say like one. I don't find twice to Madrid.
Right.
But if we go to London, I would prefer to have a weekend between.
Okay, but you're okay with that. But yeah, and you're European based, so that's less of a big deal for you. I know for Martin, it's much more onerous. I'm going to be in Europe that entire time, so it doesn't matter to me. Otherwise, I would be loudly complaining right now. Anyone else?
I found that the July 7th is the cutoff time.
Sorry?
2 weeks
2 weeks
before.
before.
2 weeks. Okay, I'm not concerned.
Worst case is like, either you get an override or we submit the IETF week.
Ted, it sounds like it's going to be local for you, maybe extremely local. But, yeah. Anyone online with any thoughts?
I mean, we need to go to the main list because.
Of course. Yeah. So, all right. So what we'll do is once we get a little clarity about what the ISG feels about this, we'll adjust accordingly and we'll send a poll to the list and get a sense of where everyone's at, and then we'll make some announcements. Sound good?
Sounds good.
Eric.
So just speaking for the guy who will be discussing this in a couple of hours. Typically, the block before the IETF plenary is basically for the AD, so Mike, because it's pretty busy. And typically to avoid overlap of the people. But there are not too many IETF people in this room,
Exactly.
right? So that's not a big deal.
That's why we think it's maybe
It's doable,
justifies an exception. Yes.
specifically to do it in Madrid.
And if we can find a facility in Madrid, if we have to fall back to Lisbon or London, does that make it more?
I mean, my issue with London is the different visas, right?
Yeah.
That's a big, I mean, maybe not for you, but for some people.
Mike? So, Mike is, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think with the momentum, it makes sense to discuss with the ISG. I think there's good grounds to argue for an exception here. I just would want to see that is what the working group feels strongly that they need to do to make progress. And so, yeah, I'm looking for that feedback on the list and in the room. And if that's what people want to do, we can probably make it happen.
Okay. That's great. Thank you, Mike.
So first week of July is not a first week?
I doubt it's an option for any Americans.
All right.
I'm sorry, what was that?
There was a question about the first week of July.
I'm asking because the IQ meeting is in the second week of July.
Right. And what's this is in the second week of July as well.
IQ is in June. Oh, you're wrong.
I cancel in June in Prague.
Right.
Yeah, okay then.
And I mean, and you know, to be honest, there are always going to be individual conflicts of various sorts, and so we'll listen to those, but we can't engineer it so that everyone avoids every conflict.
Okay. So,
We just have to try and do the best we can.
June should not be in, like, we can't do June at all.
June is a little problematic because I know there are people with other commitments
Yeah.
in June, and it's getting closer.
Or like IGF.
Exactly. And there's IAB meetings and other stuff.
So, but sorry, I was looking at wrong with my calendar. So I would be at the WISIS and maybe.
Yeah, I'll be there, and I was thinking that if we end up choosing that week, I would probably just get a WISIS for 2 or 3 days and then shift over.
Should we decide which week?
The week, 2 weeks before ITF.
I'll point out that, and I'm not finding good with it. It's related, AI for Good, which is an ITU event, is actually in Geneva the week before. It's the week of like July 8th.
Right, and we had 1 or 2 people here who were talking about going to that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Seems like that.
So,
So that's another conflict.
so the week of the 14th in Lisbon starts sounding like a very attractive, if it could be made to work for this.
Well,
Yes,
wherever we
Madrid.
can manage, but with a
And
bias towards close to
And then
Madrid.
Madrid, Lisbon came on.
I think we'll wait for a soft okay from the IASG for the week before and then go for a doodle poll.
Yeah.
Because I think we can.
And explain the rationales, yeah. But if anyone, if we want to meet in Madrid, we really do need a solid offer of a facility that's appropriate, which means a certain amount of space, and, you know, no NDA to get in and that sort of thing.
So we have office in Madrid, and we have 2 rooms that are available that week that can host up to 80 people each.
That's 80 people in a classroom setup?
In classroom setup, 30 people, and the other one 32 people.
Okay, but we need, generally we prefer a U-shape or a conference table, and so that's gonna be less than that number.
Usually 26 people, and then
That works.
the other one 24 people.
Oof, that's close. If we have just this many people show up, we'll be fine. If we have even a couple more, then that's not gonna work. We can run a registration process again, but prefer not to. Sorry?
Well, yes, but
Putting
with
it,
it being adjacent to an IETF
Right.
meeting, we may get.
it's a moral hazard being next to an IETF meeting. You get what are somewhat derogatorily called tourists.
You can't have it the same week as the IETF.
No, that will be a hard no.
And how much space are we looking at potentially?
I think we'd be comfortable with a room capable of taking 30 people in a U-shape. I think that would probably be
So
okay.
basically, the size that we have here may be slightly larger.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, if this room, if that wall were closed and like 1.5 meters that way, that would be about right.
I mean, I would still encourage us, I can vote as well, but I think it's not entirely crazy to ask the LLC if in fact they have a meeting room that would be available.
Sure. I'm happy to ask, I'm just anticipating a no.
Because I know the SDTA is in that hotel the week before the IETF, but we're not using as much space as the IETF, so there should be meeting rooms available in the, whatever that name of the venue, but.
Right, it's just they would need to expend budget on that.
It's possible, as the guy who used to run the meetings
Okay.
committee. it's
Glenn,
possible
we'll
to
look
have
into it.
space.
We'll look into it.
And do you intend to have 2 meetings during the IETF meeting?
That's a good question. I think it depends on timings and everything
I
else.
think we probably just ask for one.
Yeah.
It is a bad one, is the meeting.
Because if we
Right.
had the,
Yeah, we wouldn't not request a meeting. We would still have a meeting because we would need to synchronize with the wider IETF community, report where we're at, get further input. The question is whether that justifies 1 or 2 meetings. I think.
Yeah, it's worth noting there's an informal scheduling policy that if you request 2 meeting slots, one of them will be on Friday.
Oh, really?
So then the question becomes, do we want to, if we had the interim the week before, do we want Monday and Friday, or do we want a week later? Which both of those seem a little bit awkward if we're trying to continue off of an interim.
I think for the non-IETF folks, like that becomes very unattractive.
Yeah,
Just,
yeah. I'd rather just have a Thursday, Friday interim the week before, and then
Monday.
and then a Monday meeting for ITF, to have a preference for Monday for the ITF, yeah. And then you just have a catch up.
And it helps people on a day pass to pay for a day pass if it's 1 meeting.
Yeah.
Rather than 2.
That's a very good point, actually, yeah. I think part of the pushback we've seen from for the ISG's attention, part of the pushback we've seen from people who aren't ITF regulars is the cost of the meeting registration combined with the uncertainty around scheduling is a really unpleasant experience.
It's also the room block for an IETF hotel has a 3-day, like it will hold the rate either side. So if you go for the later end of that week, it will also be better value for people.
Oh, I see. So they can just reserve a whole section. Oh, that's actually quite nice, actually. Yeah. So Miriam, I heard you were going to look into it. Gary, you have a possibility, but it might not be appropriate. If you could maybe double check that.
So,
You've got the figures in
Yeah.
front of you, so.
Yeah.
Actually, so that's an interesting question. Just in theory, could we see a show of hands if we held a meeting Thursday, Friday before ITF? Who thinks that they would attend that if it were in Madrid? Okay, so most of the people, but we lose a few. Oh, and online? Anyone online think that they would attend such a meeting?
You put your hand up.
I
Mike?
would.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay, so maybe Gary's room would be okay. We would just have to, I think, have a registration process again to make sure that we knew how many people were coming.
You had Brian another pop-up briefing.
Oh, okay. Brian, do you think you would?
Yeah, I'd say a good chance the Thursday or Friday before Madrid.
Okay, thanks.
Would it be 1 or 2 days? Possibly do Friday.
Sorry?
I could probably do Friday if it's 1 day.
Okay. Well, I think we would hold a 2-day meeting and you'd have to come for 1 day then.
Sebastian also said yes.
Sebastian also said yes. Okay.
That was a maybe for me.
Maybe, okay. All right, well, it seems like that's kind of where we're converging if we're allowed. And Mary, if you could look into it, and Gary, keep it in, oh, thank you, lovely. And I think that's our fallback, I guess, if we need to, we can do that. Anything else on this? No. Okay. And then we're supposed to ship in August. If we need another interim after Madrid, I'm concerned, I guess. But we'll talk about that then.
Shipping in August is going to be pretty challenging.
It is already going to be very challenging.
Can you define shipping?
So from our perspective, shipping means going through that working group last call process we talked about, and then handing the document off to the area director. And so that's our milestone. Now, the area director may give the document right back to us, but we'll deal with that.
It's like, this is not good enough.
Right. Or you didn't think about this, or you're not meeting your charter, or some editorial work needs to happen, or whatever. Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And usually there are some small usually.
Okay. So that's the planning component. I guess the question is how best to use the.
Just to make a point, like, I guess from the perspective of outside parties who are interested in having this proposal, the point of interest is where it becomes referenceable.
I couldn't quite hear that. What else?
I think the main question from people outside of this process is at which point does this become something that can be referenced in a stable way?
Right. Well,
Stable reference is probably another 6 months on.
right. The RFC has to go through the IETF consensus process, which IETF last call is usually 2 weeks.
Yeah, but it can take a couple of.
Right, but there's process around both sides of that where the area director and then the ISG have to get it in the right state. They have a 2-week IETF last call, and then they process that feedback that's gotten during that last call period. That takes weeks to a month or two, and then it goes into the RFC editor queue. The RFC editor queue, there are statistics on how long it takes things to get through the RFC editor queue, and so we're looking at.
It wouldn't be blocked on anything.
No.
So
weeks to months.
I think it's a couple of bits in the order of 4 to 6 weeks.
I think we can get a RFC number before the RFC is published. At
Yes.
least like if somebody wants it.
I'm not interested in, my question was sort of like to have an understanding if you talk to sort of people to tell them what this means in ballpark numbers, because if you say ship, like that sounds like, oh, it's done, but.
Well, so there are two answers. If someone believes that they need an RFC and it needs to be a published RFC, that's the very end of this whole process. And we can only confidently say that if we ship in August, it will be before the end of the year, I would say. That's a little pessimistic, but experience shows that pessimism is justified.
I think that's good for expectation.
Right.
Outside.
If the question is, at what point is the document considered stable enough that it's not going to meaningfully change? That will be after it goes through IETF last call and is approved by the ISG, and any necessary changes are incorporated.
Which would be 6 weeks, I would say.
Yeah, something in the order of 6 weeks to 2 months.
Thank you.
And that's before it's shipped.
No, after.
That's from August. So say we manage to do something and pass it to the ISG on the 1st of August. There's the process to get it to stable probably will take until the end of September. Would be my guess, given ISG cycles and all the various
And
things
the last
that
one must
happen.
be
And that would
3
be
weeks
fast.
because that's after the IETF meeting again, right?
So that would be fast at that point.
Yeah.
I think you should also be taking into account that a number of non-ITF participants are probably used to a document development cycle where you get to a very stable state and then you issue for comments, you use a comment window. We might find ourselves receiving a lot of comments back once we get to a more stable state, which then may delay by a few weeks as the group itself moves to those comments.
Right, so that I would not count on it being done before the end of October.
So you're
that's the stable point. From the point that it's stable, I would imagine another month or two before it gets an RC number, probably. And that's if we're fast.
Now, we can ask the ISG to expedite, we can ask the RC editor expedite, but they have other pressures as well.
Save a whole lot of time.
No.
I think the question is how quickly can we get a document out of the working group? I think that's the biggest thing.
That's under our control.
And what's driving the August deadline?
Our charter,
That's essentially what we said.
that's what we would agreed to.
Is there an external thing that motivated that? I've been curious about this myself. Is there something that?
It's a very rapidly moving area, and there are many other potential proposals in this area. And so if we don't move quickly, the work is potentially overcome by events, either by other actors or by regulators. Yes.
And there's this sort of alliance, I don't know if that's the driver, but like the relevant provisions of the EUAI Act come into force on the 2nd of August. Now, what that exactly means is.
It takes time for them to implement as well, yes.
Yes, but like, sort of like at that point, sort of like questions about how to comply, if to comply, et cetera, become even more pertinent. And like, I think it would be useful to have something relatively quickly after that.
Yeah, if not before.
If not before, but like, if you're honest, the whole process, like even the European Commission is probably not sort of capable of keeping all their deadlines in this process. It's complex work on all sides.
Yeah, we can certainly have the draft in place ahead of that time. And I would expect it would be relatively complete once we've done the work that follows on from the interim, which I imagine we can do in the very end of July.
There's going to be a busy period there.
There's been a queue for quite a long time. It seems like the chairs aren't bringing
Oh,
Go ahead. And so part of my question was, is there going to be anything to try and implement at the hackathon? So that between the meeting and the IETF meeting, there's going to be a hackathon activity where people can try and test. And the reason I ask this is for something to actually be considered stable, one of the useful tests for the ISG is to know whether people reading the document produce code that works. And so having some hackathon activity may in fact accelerate us on our way toward actually meeting the deadline. And I kind of wondered, had people been thinking about that or not? Because I think the stability of the reference is important, but the demonstration that it runs is in many ways just as critical. And I hadn't heard any discussion about it.
My immediate thought there is that something that would be appropriate for a hackathon project might be like a validator.
Anybody else have thought?
On this? So we have, Boris, did you want to say something?
Cars, you're next.
Oh, it's not about, so it's totally, so basically, I think Hero, yesterday mentioned that, maybe we can have a research group. And, I think that that's very necessary, especially to include voices that cannot attend meeting, cannot get engaged with, the working group. So if they have research, especially with, from regions that are not active here. So I wonder if I would like what the process for that would be. Would we go to IRTF? Is it too difficult?
I do have a thought. on this first. If there's people doing this kind of research, I think like we can arrange an IAB technical session. Martin and Miriam probably can go and work on an IAB technical session. There's a lot of the stuff that goes into the IETF Open kind of like gates through this, so we can actually figure out if there's a community behind this, because that's completely separate from us. It's not going to come from us, the IETF like proposed research group stuff, right? But the idea is like if you kind of like not like one set of people. Usually what we look for is like people kind of doing different things in the area, like so we can get them together. So if we can find the community, we can set up a technical discussion with the IAB, and then we can go from there. Like the IITF chair would be on those meetings, and then we can start going from there.
So I was asking which kind of research, because for example, measurement stuff, there's a lot of measurement studies that can go into.
Miriam, please speak up.
Miriam,
I'm
speak
sorry.
up.
I was asking what kind of research you're looking for, because measurement studies are happening at the moment a lot, and those can go into memberships. We already invited somebody to present some work, but that person could join the next meeting and have a talk.
Yeah, I think that could be one, in my opinion, some of the research that was presented during the workshop also could be like topics could be along those lines. And yeah, we can.
Right. There are a number of fora in the RTF that might be appropriate, rather than just having one for this topic, what you're hearing.
So.
And we can help facilitate that, or get to the right people.
Just that it, so if it's possible to have like a specific group, because the community is there, we just have to go and tell them that here is where you can contribute your paper, we can have discussion and stuff like that.
Right.
So that, you know, they.
Okay. Let's take this offline, and we'll get you talking to the IRTF chair as well, and because that's the appropriate. You know, we can't do that here, and we don't have the authority to create research groups here. So.
We think we can hold that
Sure.
On the other hand, if we create a research group at the IETF, we can wonder the ISG evaluation. Oh, why are we already evaluating proposal if we are still running a research group?
Right.
Right.
Yeah, my concern would be
top and
managing conflicts and making sure there's clarity about which group is doing what, and then that would be a concern that would need to be managed.
Gary?
Back to Ted's point, we have the open source parser matcher that is used by at least 3 large crawlers, and it requires, like for the robots.txt part, if we are going down with on the robots.txt route, it requires 3 lines change, so it's minimal, and it has a reporting abstraction which we can use for like a validator thing. It's used in Google Search Console and in other places as well. So for like adoption and to show that it works, that is minimal work.
And it's open source, so if people detect issue, we can contribute back.
And I guess the question is, would it be useful for there to be a group of people working on enhancements to that and stuff around it at the hackathon in Madrid? Or is that something that could happen more effectively, you know, offline?
It's on GitHub, so anyone could contribute to it if they wanted. They tried, but it was like, why are you doing this?
I guess, you know, if we met Thursday, Friday in Madrid, or even Lisbon, and folks went to Madrid, you know, overnight Friday, then Saturday, Sunday is the hackathon. And so that's an opportunity if folks are willing to you know, get together on projects like that.
It's still a $0 registration fee, so
For the
are able to attend the hackathon without paying full IETF registration. So you can still do what was discussed earlier of using a day pass for Monday meeting while still contributing over there.
Well, let's see how the scheduling works out, and that sounds like it's an interesting thing that we'll try to promote to see if we can get some momentum around that thing.
Sebastian said on the chat that like Lithium was facilitating declarations and they're willing to verify the vocabulary.
Okay, great. And we can get an implementations page on the website when we get to that point.
So just quickly, wanted to, so maybe we should ensure that also we have some crawlers that can attend these hackathons to,
If possible.
And hackathon participation can also be remote. So like people who are not going to either of those meetings can also participate. We've had teams where like sometimes the whole team has been remote, or somebody like one or two people like on site and the rest of them are remote. Like it's worked pretty well.
Right. Q&A?
Good.
Okay. Anything else? So we understand the path forward, now we just need to walk down it.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've got, yeah, Gary.
No, Q.
Oh,
Yeah, Sebastian. I just
My last comment in the chat. So I think it's a two-sided relationship between like the declarants and the receiving parties, and it would be good if there would be some kind of engagement and involvement from the receiving parties, whether they feel fine with the vocabulary and whether that is something that they can work with. And so I think that is important to verify at some stage, even before like publication of some kind of document.
Thank you. And Sebastian, by recipients, do you mean the crawlers like Fars was talking about, or are you talking about like what subset of people are you talking about, and how do you reach out to them?
Yeah, I think it's crawlers on the one hand, and I would assume that model developers would be using the message that is provided by the declarants. I mean, the whole point is that the preferences that I expressed in the vocabulary will be received by the parties who are making use of the content that is being published on websites or through other channels. And so it's an important point whether the message goes into the void or is received at some point in good faith and order.
Yeah, and probably somebody like a timid robot as well, right? Like because we had to also check whether these are getting passed through and communicated like further, right? Like so, I think that's something probably we need to verify as a third point.
Yeah. I think that listening to this, we'll have initial drafts, hopefully in a fairly short amount of time. We'll have some discussions around those, develop them. We'll have probably a virtual interim, refine a bit more, get some very rough consensus that that's the right direction to go. And once we have drafts that we've iterated on a bit, we're going to need to propagate those out to a wider audience to start gathering that feedback that Sebastian was talking about, making sure that folks who aren't in the room have a chance to have a good look at them before we go to our last calls, so we can make sure that we're matching some of the expectations out there. Some amount of chance of implementation. But we'll get there.
That's good.
Yeah. Okay. So we've got we scheduled to stop at noon today. I double checked the agenda. We've got 2 hours, and I think we're open as to how we use that most productively. Would folks like to go and continue to discuss the issues on attachment and on the vocabulary? My inclination would maybe be to go back to vocabulary, since that's a little more foundational. Yeah? So then, going through the issues for the vocabulary, and we will get these into an issues list soon.
Sebastian, is there a proposal you have?
Yeah, I would have a question whether it would be possible to address the clarification of what is the intention and the meaning of opt-in. Because that's something I try to wrap my head around and try to understand. And we didn't talk much about it. We only said like, okay, it could be something like a signaling that for training, or it could be something like a grant of a license or a grant of a permission. So I would like to discuss or ask if any one of you would have any kind of idea what opt-in would potentially entail.
Well, I think the place we left at it in the discussions we've had, and maybe we haven't spent much time talking about it this week, is that our intention is to create the vocabulary and then the serialization of that vocabulary and the attachment mechanism where it can be used to express both an opt-out and an opt-in. But the actual regime in place is legally defined. We do not define the default state, and especially if you don't make declarations, we don't define what the implications of that are. And so our intention then is to create a regime that could be used in, or a mechanism that could be used in a regime that is legally default opt-in. I think that's where we're at. Any finer point on that from anyone?
Martin was in queue.
Yeah.
Martin?
So I think the thing that I think distinguishes this from what Sebastian's asking about is the question of authorization and authority and those questions. When you're talking about this system, if it were an authorization type system where an opt-in means I formally grant permission to use this and I am authorized to grant that permission, and I maybe need to identify the entities that permission is granted to, then you pick up a whole bunch of extra requirements from a technical perspective in terms of identification and
trust,
the bindings to the content and all sorts of things like that. And that's, I think, where the Lycium system is trying to head. This is much less than that in the sense that we're not determining who's making an expression of preference. We're just allowing anyone to do that. We're not saying under what terms the authorization exists. We're simply saying that someone has a preference about how this content is treated, and it is thus. And that is all. That maybe is less useful in some cases, but we've found that there's a template that I think is useful here with the global privacy control, which is to say that the global privacy control is a very simple signal that carries one bit of information that says, I would rather not have my personal information sold or shared with other entities. And that ties into legislation that basically says that unless you have other means of knowing that someone has authorized this, you treat this generic expression of preference as overriding and backed by law. And that's the sort of thing that I would expect to have happen here. And certainly the TDM opt-out in EU law is exactly in that shape already. If those doing enforcement recognize the thing that we develop as an effective technical preference.
Right. And so, I guess one view then would be that we are not shipping a system that is necessarily technically complete for an opt-in regime. But we want to make sure that we don't preclude what we do to be able to be built upon in the future to enable such a regime.
So as a person who has on the list multiple times advocated for an opt-in support, one of the things I was hoping for out of that is that whatever we do reduce, it doesn't preclude its use or make a user of it jump through hoops in order to use it in an environment where, let's say, a different framework legally established that opt-in was required, that you had to have a positive signal that you were joining it. And so long as whatever we produce, from my perspective, doesn't make that difficult, then I think my perspective we get right down.
I think it's fairly clear, like from meeting and every discussion we had before or after, that it's that's kind of what we're going towards, right? Like we're not precluding.
And based upon the discussion this week, I haven't seen anything that would say that I've got a worry there.
Thank you. Okay.
So I wanted to pull back to something that Alyssa put into the chat in the discussion yesterday, and that is when you have an opt-in signal, you can end up in situations where the parallel between the opt-in signal and the opt-out signal isn't in fact a pure inverse. And the one that I think you and Martin and Alyssa were talking about is the difficulty of dealing with non-commercial use. So saying commercial equal no is not the same as saying non-commercial equal yes. Because commercial equal no has no signal around non-commercial use. It's not a positive opt-in. And I think from a syntactic perspective, we have to recognize that there will be cases where the signal that you use in an opt-in and an opt-out environment vary because that lack of an inverse property between the two. And I think that means we're signing up to a little bit of cruft already. Yay, our first technical debt! Because we're going to have to acknowledge that if we're going to have a syntax rich enough to do both, in my opinion. Martin, do you want to expand on that particular example since you and Alyssa were?
Yeah, and I think part of this problem is understanding the scope of the domain in which the commercial and non-commercial exist, and that I think is one thing that we got to. Commercial versus non-commercial is a binary choice, but as Ted pointed out, if they just exist on their own in a vacuum, having one or the other with the ability to turn it on or off doesn't carry any particular value because it doesn't say anything about the other half. But if you have the ability to talk about the envelope in which both of those sit, then you do have that ability. And so it's a little complicated, and it depends on how we deal with this subsetting, nesting, hierarchical thing that we were talking about yesterday. And if we have a clear direction on that thing, that may give us an answer to the commercial, non-commercial case, even if we don't intend to use it. But if we don't have that clarity, then we'll end up very much confused.
So if I remember correctly, Alyssa's point was like we didn't need to have subsetting. I think that kind of leads from that because she was saying like, hey, like if you have a known set of things, you could probably just make a statement for each one of them, right? It's like kind of what she was coming up with, right? So I think that kind of depends on like what we resolve on that side.
Right.
Sonia? Good, very done.
Yes.
Okay. Sonia?
Sorry, not trying to capitalize.
I think my understanding of what the opt-out or rather opt-in was that it applied when you have the broad TDM opt-out and then you opt-in. Is that not the case? Are we saying this is purely an opt-in preference?
Yeah, this is a good point.
This is, and I think this brings about a huge amount of complexity if it's the latter, because, and also I think we're not entirely clear, or at least I'm not, as to whether or not we're trying to map the nuances of particular legal frameworks, or we're setting preferences that are independent of those legal frameworks, but helpful for anyone wanting to implement them. There are no jurisdictions that require an opt-in amendment. And I think trying to combine the two leads to a huge number of variables in terms of complexity of trying to add these together. And I think also it will add a huge amount of confusion as to how these preferences should be used, because people will assume, you know, what's the default at that point in terms of people actually choosing an opt-out, opt-in, or nothing.
Right. Well, again, we don't determine the defaults. That's not what we're doing here. That is utterly up to the legal regime. Just the discussions to date, all we've said about the latter is that we want to make sure that what we design could be used in an opt-in regime with further work. Not that it is an opt-in regime, you know, not that it's an opt-in mechanism itself. And I think that the way that our primitives are aligned, the way that the vocabulary is completely separated, that's relatively trivial. We're not designing it to be exclusive to opt-out. But the other half of your question, very relevant. I think the complexities that we're talking about. It strikes me that one of the really interesting things to do at the hackathon would be not only to talk just about a robots.txt validator, but to have web tool that says, okay, here's your robots.txt, here's what came in the content, what is the resulting preferences, as applied, combined, and what does it mean for the different use cases of, commercial or non-commercial, whatever we decide is in the vocabulary, which, based on discussions yesterday, by the way, commercial, non-commercial is not part of it, but we'll see how we go. That would be a useful tool to illustrate, and also then, within a legal regime, what is this policy? What do these preferences actually mean? I'd love to see that kind of end-to-end demonstration rather than just a robots.txt tool.
I think Paul is next.
Yeah. I think it's important to just, I think we're using the opt-out, opt-in language on two different layers of the discussion, right? Like one is what Sonia pointed to in response to the default in a current legal regime. And I think we need to make sure that the vocabulary that we're developing can be used in a sort of legal regime where sort of like really requires anything, right? Like, but where if you want to change from the default, you have to opt out, and there's legal regimes. I think I wouldn't agree with you. Like, I think technically in the current UK situation, like if you wanted to clearly signal that something can be used for AI training, you would probably need to send some positive signals, so an opt-in. And I think like it's a realistic assumption that there may be jurisdictions in the world in the future where a positive signal is required from someone who wants to make sure that content can be used, right? Like, so that's the opt-in, opt-out on the very ideological debate. Like, there's huge discussions in the UK consultation, but generally, like, I think you see a lot of the opt-out regime in the EU has engendered a lot of resistance from creators, from rights holders who said, like, opt-in is the wrong approach. It should, opt-out is the wrong approach. This should be opt-in. It's everything in copyright is, etc. So that's the very high level thing. And then we have the lower level, which I don't think is, it's more, is that thing where you play with the elements of the vocabulary by combining yes and no, or allow, disallowed values, or whatever, like these sort of value pairs, to set a policy that, for example, says, not all TDM is fine, search is fine, generative AI is not fine, right? Like that I wouldn't necessarily call this sort of this yes-no value setting. I would reserve the opt-out, opt-in terminology for the sort of relationship to the legal defaults that we operate in.
I think so, yeah. That makes sense.
Because that's how the concept is generally understood. Most people who use this, throw these terms around on social media or something, they don't think about like individual settings.
It's about the absence of positive action and what that implies.
Paul and Sonia, like there's Sebastian posted something on the chat if you can take a look at it as well, and if you want to comment further. And Sebastian, if you want to talk about it, you can get in line as well. Martin?
Yeah, so I think that even in a strictly opt-out legal regime or a strictly opt-in legal regime, having both of the tools does give us some value in the sense that, let's say that we're in Europe and we're following the TDM rules, you can, at least with the hierarchical system that we have, say TDM yes, but Gen AI no, and you're somewhat saying, maybe I'll invert it the other way around. Invert that. TDM no, Gen AI yes, and what you're doing is you're opting out of all of those other uses, right? And so even in that system, your scoping of your opt-out becomes much more under your control. And so the way that I like to think of the yes no is operating on two levels, as Paul suggested. One being the granularity of the preferences, and then we have a separate problem to deal with when we talk about the quality of an opt-in, for instance. So I've been dealing a little bit with the question of age verification and what is considered sufficient evidence that someone is over the age of X, depending on the use case. And in that case, we're seeing that governments are looking for something more than a self-assertion in those contexts. So it may be the case that in an opt-in regime, the requirements are going to be stronger in terms of being able to demonstrate. I think often it comes to a responsibility on the content consumer to demonstrate that they have positive affirmation from someone who is recognized as being able to exercise that opt-in. And so we may not be at that level of evidence, but it's going to depend on what the requirements are in the various jurisdictions as to whether or not the thing that we produce right now is sufficient for opt-in, or whether we need additional mechanisms layered on top of that. So keeping in mind the potential for mechanisms to need to be added onto this for an opt-in regime is something that I think folks like Glenn need to keep in mind. But I don't think what we have stops us from being on that path right now.
My name is Timid Robot. I wonder if a discussion about opt-in or opt-out jurisdictions is to some degree irrelevant, because it will never be true for all jurisdictions, right? Like, we're not dealing with a single. We'll never encounter a world in which there is a single opt-in or opt-out jurisdiction. I think that the vocabulary, one, should include a hierarchy, and two, it should the vocabulary should the terminology should set the top level, like TDM yes or TDM no, as a recommendation to the user, that top level always be set as a yes or no value, to then set the context of all the other declarations, so that the meaning is clear, kind of regardless of the jurisdiction in which it is ingested or applied. And I would also like to see the vocabulary recommend people use the most permissive set of values that they feel comfortable with.
Could you please check how I put that in notes? I'm not sure I calculated it. In general, please check how I put your.
If you want to make a quick comment.
Very quick thing, I'm a bit squeezy by a vocabulary making recommendations. Like, I think that vocabulary is a very neutral thing. Like, I think that probably should be somewhere maybe in the context, but inside vocabulary.
Well, we have, like, every RFC has the section at the top with the special words: must, must not, should not, shall not, recommend, not recommended.
No. Those exist to enable interoperability,
and
not to encourage particular behaviors.
Okay, thank you.
Joe?
I think a general comment that this is going to be most useful for people in regimes where there is either an opt-in or an opt-out. And there's a great advantage in having a vocabulary that's broad enough to apply in any legal regime that it might apply in. I think this, I don't know if this does push back on what you were saying slightly, Tim Robot, that you've got to anticipate this hopefully being picked up by everybody. One thing that would be a bad outcome, I think, for developers and rights holders is like derivative spin-offs of the vocabulary in different jurisdictions, because people feel like the vocabulary isn't impressive enough for them, or doesn't meet some of the criteria. In terms of whether or not we have an opt-in or an opt-out, I think that more important is to recognize that in many jurisdictions, this issue is being raised because the non-commercial exceptions that have been introduced have not been very successful by most people's standards. Like, either commercial enterprises pretend they're non-commercial and do stuff anyway, maybe sneakily, and or non-commercial enterprises actually aren't confident enough for various reasons to say that they are definitely non-commercial and therefore don't benefit from the exception. So I know this is like really in the weeds of jurisdictions doing TDM exceptions, but it might be fine where we discussed a bit the day before about I would like to express preferences that may or may not be legal binding, but the whole point of this exercise from a copyright law point of view is that the non-commercial exception failed to a considerable extent to have anything done. So I'm not sure it's that relevant what the working group actually delivers.
Thank you. Pierce?
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I just wanted to sort of iterate that we need to get clarity on exactly how this opt-in and opt-out is going to work with respect to sort of multiple jurisdictions. I mean, I think particularly around how we're going to, people want to be able to express the sort of preferences, potentially different preferences to different jurisdictions, and then have the combination of their default opt-in and opt-out as well taken into consideration. But I mean, I imagine, like many organizations, they may well want to present different preferences to different jurisdictions, and how that would be done. Is that just sort of up to the, is that seen as up to the sort of content providers to just sort of geo kind of slice up and send different kind of robot.txt to them, or are we looking at mechanisms to differentiate or allow for differentiation? Just kind of a question really. I wasn't quite clear on what the thinking was, but also something I think it's important to consider. Thanks.
Glenn?
I want to raise the same issue question that Piers just did. Specifically, it's not unlikely. I'm quiet for change. Wow. I raised the same issue as Piers just did, because it's not unlikely that we will have situations with content where we will have different regimes with maybe even similar goals, openness, but different interpretations and different meanings. And I could see a content rights holder want to say, hey, in the EU, this is how I want my preferences set. In the US, this is how I would like my preferences set. And so I'm wondering if in the grammar, we want to be able to have a hierarchical grouping where I could set that to say, this is my European Union answers. Here are my US answers, and here's my other default answers as a organizational structure in the department's design.
What would you do with that as a app developer or as someone training? What jurisdiction do you look at?
So as an app developer, if I'm sitting in the EU when I retrieve that content, I would follow the EU preferences. If I'm sitting in the US, I would follow the US preferences. We already have a version of this today, by the way, I'll point out, in that we have a lot of websites in the United States that deny access based upon being in the EU, because they don't want to comply with GDPR. They basically say, no, thank you. So we've got sort of a version already that says, EU people go away, don't use me because I don't want to comply with GDPR.
So Glenn, before we start adding new mechanisms like that, I think we should get a better understanding of, given some example documents or example combinations of preferences, how would they apply in different regimes, and see if there's how they behave. And if there's a problem, then we can start designing mechanisms to address that.
That's a good point, but let me give you an example today. So under the EU approach of you can use this stuff, we're going to give you a default exception. That doesn't necessarily translate in the US under the US rules. And so we already have a.
But the question is, how would that change what they express in the document? And that's what we should.
I mean, it's very likely. So let us say, and this is a concrete example, that the European said, yes, you can use this for trading non-commercial stuff. You're perfectly allowed. You're open to go. And so I may say in the European context, no, I don't want my stuff used. But if I'm saying no to this, I recognize this is an EU exception, but I'm going to say no to it so that I'm on the record as saying no. And you have to override me with the EU rules that say yes, you can. In the US context, I may evaluate and say, yes, you can in the US, but because I now will follow the other rules that the US follows for enabling stuff and the limitations that place on.
Can I just jump in? Like,
Quick,
this is
if you
not-
do a quick comment,
Yeah,
yes.
but like, the thing that we said we move forward is not one which is basing itself on a specific legal regime. Like, if we, like, it says, like, you express preferences, these preferences will need to be interpreted independent, like, by whoever uses them in combination with whatever legal things apply to them. So if you say, like, I want to say no to my use, you can say no, won't use this. In the EU, this will probably be interpreted as an opt-out backed by law. In the US, it will be interpreted, oh, these people don't want to, but I think it's fair use, or maybe I don't think it's fair use, like, you can follow the preference. But like, we are not proposing, and like, an August deadline is not like if we're writing some kind of licensing system which leverages into sort of specificities of international
Not right now.
law. We don't.
No, I was not, let me be clear, was not proposing we go there. I was simply saying that having a mechanism that allows me to, through some high-level identifier, say for this territory, I want to apply the following purposes. For a different territory, I want a set of different purposes. I'm not making a claim to regimes or things like that. I'm just setting territorial level differences in the purposes I express.
Do you know, like?
Yeah. It's like national sort of national broadcasters in our case, for example. Like we want to present different preferences.
We do have a queue.
I'm just simply saying, we do have this in place today in other places where you use something as simple as EU and country codes to express
I think if you want to make a proposal, Glenn, go for it, but I think the general answer has been no until this point, to have some kind of things into the vocabulary itself, because the vocabulary has to be neutral of this. But if you want to make a proposal, please go ahead and make a proposal when the vocabulary draft is out, right? I think we can talk about it after, but not like this, because I don't think we could resolve this, because it's pretty.
Sure, I was thinking resolve. I want to get it on the table.
Thank you, thanks.
Yeah, I mean, people are trying to do this already anyway, just by doing it.
Pierce,
fine.
We have a queue, Pierce.
I guess it was all part of the same thing. That was why I was chipping in there, but anyway.
Thank you. Sebastian, go for it.
Just going back to the opt-in, I wanted to comment on what I wrote in the chat. So I think that there is a case for opt-in. I just wanted to warn that this opt-in shouldn't be considered as a general permission to do whatever you would like with the content, because there are like legal regimes, what we discussed right now. What I see from the market, what I get from the customers and clients, and is that there is definitely a requirement to indicate through some kind of mechanism like an opt-in that the rights holders or declarants would be open for kind of term negotiations, so that they would be willing to offer content for training purposes. I think that's, at least from my perspective, a very strong and repeating signal that I get from creators and the community. Second, I think there is a case where archives or libraries may actively flag content that is in the public domain or openly licensed. So where we could use that based on the rationale that is being provided with that kind of statement, that can be that is not necessarily connected to the entity who's making the claim. So that can be like an objective kind of statement when you consider, let's say, the death of the creator and a certain time period. And the third part is that if you make an opt-out declaration, there should be some kind of a way to revoke or update or have like a supersede of this opt-out. That could be considered in the context of the opt-in, because it would kind of revoke the opt-out that's a rights holder, a previous rights holder may have set. So just to bring some arguments for opt-in, but keep repeating the warning that this shouldn't be confused with the permission.
Thank you. Salim?
Thanks. Yeah, I guess I still go back to the question, are we building controls for legal compliance or are we building controls for preferences? Because I think we're making the false assumption that these preferences are a legal requirement to follow because they're copyright relevant acts, and they're not. And I think we're therefore getting them distracted by wanting to accommodate current laws and new laws. And the controls should be around preferences, and therefore they should be jurisdiction agnostic. I mean, AI developers would read the preferences and voluntarily follow those, and we would need to abide by the law in whichever jurisdiction we're operating in anyway. Because the EU, only the EU has an opt-out, and TDM is broadly defined, but it operates within a set of exceptions in Europe. And taking TDM as an example, if it's added as a preference, no one would argue that forms of TDM are not permitted globally. Otherwise, if they were, you wouldn't have the operation of the internet, for example. Nothing would work. So I think we just need to focus on these as being preferences and not ways to comply with copyright law.
Thank you. Mark?
Yeah, absolutely. When we need to keep that constantly in mind, they are preferences. The bump here is that at least one legal regime has put a hook into the expression of those preferences, and that's, I guess, the interesting part. I got on cue to say we need to keep in mind that not only that, but we are at the very beginning of this journey. I think people are just figuring out how AI is going to work. AI itself is evolving. The interesting part for me is that we need to be careful about the assumptions we make, and that's why I think we're having this discussion is that we don't want to assume a particular use of those preferences, in one case opt-out. Copyright itself is an opt-in regime, effectively, and Creative Commons is a way to affect that, which is super interesting to me. And copyright itself doesn't require technical, authentication of, an assertion of Creative Commons on my site. It sorts that out, and it's not our problem. And copyright itself is effectively a global regime, thanks to a network of treaties over the last 50 or so years. So we don't control any of those things. What we control is the preferences that we express, and making them as adaptable to the changes in the outside world as possible is in our interest, I think. And so that's all we should keep in mind, is making sure that if those different regimes out there change, that hopefully we won't have to change too much about what we create.
Thank you. I got in line to say, I think it's been brought up multiple times. I think you brought it up first, Sonia, but other people followed up as well, that opt-in is probably more involved than opt-out, a regime like that. I think the best we can do is make sure whatever we come up with can support an opt-in thing, but because there's probably going to be much more things needed that we are not going to do without scope. I think Martin was talking about authorization. I think Sebastian was talking about who's allowed to make those things, and all those things have to be built on top of what we do. So it's not necessarily useful for us. So I think that's probably something we need to be conscious of. Just make sure that we don't do anything that kind of kneecaps somebody to do an opt-in regime based on this. But I don't think we're going to do anything specific for it. Fabrice.
One point of view, my point of view on opt-in is that we have already an opt-in. It says if you not set a robot disallowing crawling, then you are allowing access to your content, and somehow this is the opt-in. So it's a kind of already by default there, and every site that want to opt-in, want to opt-out can set a robot to disallow or allow crawling. Point number one. Point number two, on hierarchy, I think we have clear problems already today on hierarchy things. This is the disallow and no index. There is clear communication from Google and Bing on this topic, but many in the webmaster community don't get it. they set no index, and they set disallow at crawling. And so, yeah, if you set disallow from crawling, we cannot see the no index tag. And so this is, they don't understand this kind of relation between allow, disallow, and access to the no index tag. Because unfortunately, somehow, when we disallow calling, we can still index the URL, just the URL. We don't see the content, but we just URL. So I feel that this protocol definition need to be very crisp in understanding the relationship between TDM and hierarchy generation things. Because else we will have continuously this problem of people not understanding the relationship between this hierarchy.
Thank you, Fabrice. Paul? So I think we're having a bit, at least the part about opt-out, opt-in is a bit of a non-discussion here. I think all of the proposals, including my draft, are pretty clear that these signal targets that can be used by attachment mechanisms to bind values to, which can be yes, they can be no, they cannot be expressed. Like that is on the vocabulary level, that's not an issue. Vocabulary you express preferences, and sort of on the attachment level thing is then doesn't attach. It's imaginable that there's attachment mechanisms which only allow you to say no to certain things. It's imaginable that there's attachment mechanisms which allow both yes and no. Sebastian made a case that in his attachment mechanism you need to also be able to reverse something via yes, no. But that's really like the opt-in, opt-out is at the level of the attachment mechanism. On the level of the vocabulary, it's defining these use cases that are targets for saying yes or no. And that is a very deliberate choice that the vocabulary is agnostic to this, because otherwise the vocabulary wouldn't work in different legal regimes as soon as we have variation. And I think we have variation already, although sort of often it's sort of more implicit that something opt-out, opt-in systems tend to be more implicit, like the EU system is very explicit about that. The other level, and I think this is something that has also informed the naming conventions that we have in this group. We started as AI controls, we came down from that and said, like, now we can't really control this. We don't necessarily, and there's most often enforcement gap, but also maybe a legal backing gap that's in there. And so I think the choice calling ourselves AI preferences, calling these things at the moment I don't think we're fully defined on them, but for preference signals is one of humility. We can't give this certainty where we say this is an enforceable right that you are expressing. Maybe in some jurisdictions you can. So we can ensure we give people a standardized way of expressing their preferences. That's the level we can operate, where we can, I think, keep a promise that we're making to some degree. And then it really is up to different legislators to say, sort of to look at how this works, and maybe they feel like we need to give more legal certainty by backing this up by the law. Maybe they see like, oh no, this is a beautiful system that works and no need for us to intervene, which is probably the preferred strategy of legislators. Let's see how this works out. But I think those two things, we're agnostic to the opt-in, opt-out at the vocabulary, and we're expressing preferences. Are like the two principles that really allow us to operate in this complex environment where it's not like copyright, where the default is the same all across the world, because here we're operating against different defaults, which makes this much more complicated.
Just to clarify, my takeaway from the discussion that we had about the vocabulary document, and if I have this wrong, we need to get that out there, was that that document would contain in one section the abstract vocabulary, and in another section how to express that vocabulary as preferences. Are we still on the same page about that? So that would be opt-in, opt-out at that second part.
But also still on a level of abstract that is more abstract than a specific abstraction.
But a specific attachment point might just use that second part and say, put that string here.
As long as we're not saying like it can only be expressed as yes or no, at least this principle is maintained. You can both assign a positive and a negative value to it, then I think we're on the same thing. If we're making choices there,
I don't think we're making choices
okay,
there.
then,
No.
then I think we're on the same.
Okay.
Thank you. Sarah?
I think we have generally common agreement that it is robots and any attachment mechanisms isn't sufficient for an opt-out regime. I think that was a common theme of yesterday. And this is just an idealized set of principles. And there was talk about having a document that would set that out to policymakers, right? Where is the gap between attachment mechanisms and legal compliance? I think there's a need to do the same with opt-in within that document. Those people who aren't do the same with the policy document as we currently talk about making opt-out, making the point where does any attachment mechanism provide a set of preferences that is then taken up by a legal regime and is seen to be compliant or not, and where is that gap? Making that same point for an opt-in regime and making that explicit, because I think we have that broad consensus in the room. It's not sufficient for opt-out, but it seems like we're going back to square one and talking about opt-in.
Okay. I think you weren't there on part one, like the document we adopted talks about opt-out all the time because it was developed in EU context. Like I made it very clear that this is like, I think it's on the list of bullet points, Eurocentrism. That this
We need to fix that.
We need to fix that.
Joe, last word.
Okay, a few small points. I agree that there's a risk of going back to square one on this. Like the discussion was like it or not inspired by the kind of EU-UK context. It's clearly not enough for a complete opt-in opt-out regime because, as we sort of made progressively more clear over the course of the discussion, this is not about enforcement, which is fine, but it's also not even about identifying rights holders, which is also fine. And you need both of those things to have a working regime. This is just like the absolute foundation of personal preferences. If it's about expressing preferences, then I think we need to be ambitious about like the role this will have in the ecosystem. And this discussion is happening in the chat about, oh, maybe there'll be like hundreds of different preferences versions, and maybe we can geofence them, and maybe this is like a massive overcomplication of the issue. It also seems to encourage a kind of strategic thinking on behalf of rights holders. Like on a philosophical level, it's kind of odd to say that my preferences towards milkshakes vary in the US than they do in the EU. Like, fine, maybe US milkshakes are different, but fundamentally, the act of TDM trading is the same to an approximation in one country to the other. And to have, or to encourage rights holders to think strategically about this, I think then overcomplicates it to the point of being unhelpful for everybody. I think we should focus ourselves on building a very strict, like independent set of vocabularies that people express. Just legislatures in whatever regions then, define how that will interact with the law. What I think would be a bad outcome is someone saying, oh, well, opting in of TDM means this in the US, but it means that in the EU. And I think it's a poor outcome for people. Okay. Yeah, in a sec. Seb, I think we do need an opt-out on your list on the chat. There was no opt-out option, and again, given that the two suggestions for using this legally that will then matter for users in a substantive way are talking about opt-out rather than opt-in, to not have a clear to not have a clear opt-out option would be odd. I think it's really easy to add a bit of vocabulary saying, here is some like nice automated route for doing a contract with me. There's loads of cool companies that do kind of automated contract setting now. That's great. That's straightforward. And as we discussed at great length from day one, saying no is not a permanent no. It might be a no and come talk to me. It just means it's not an issue. Paul, you wanted to say something?
I just want to say like one thing where like I think the technology that we differ with differs from a lot of the other examples is that so far the artifacts that have produced generally seem to be global, universal artifacts. Like I know very little sort of like examples of people where they sort of try to only use this AI model in jurisdiction X, right? Like the training takes somewhere place. It's a jurisdictional thing where you can train in one place for something that is available globally, which sort of also adds some specific concerns to this. Like I think some legislators figure out that sort of like the territorial principles of copyright are not necessarily like a very sort of well-aligned thing with this. Let's not get into this, but like this is also.
I don't agree with your observation, but I won't debate.
I think like no matter what, like I think it's still out of scope, right? Like there might be stuff that like is useful for this thing, but we're not chartered to do it, and we probably won't be able to finish if we decide to get that in scope, right? Like, but Glenn, like, and peers, like, if you had like specific proposals that are like excellent, just make them and see what happens, right? Because I personally think this is sitting on top of the any kind of mechanisms we build, but we can actually see what it is, right? Like, it could be you could be delivering different attachment stuff.
I'm thinking the proposal I make would be something as simple as adding an element to the vocabulary that allows for a UN country code to be expressed.
Right. We do need to ruthlessly manage our time for these initial deliverables. So we need to keep those kinds of proposals
Understood.
in parallel.
Mark,
Yeah.
but let me be clear. I understand that. But if we produce something here that the rights holder community cannot get their energy behind, we're going to have a different problem in that we'll produce something on time, but we'll be in a longer battle where the rights holders say, this is unworkable, this is terrible. Sure. And we have an opportunity right now where we have the rights holder community and the technical community together in the room talking about what is needed and exploring deployment strategies. Sure. That we can resolve this now versus having a battle later. Plus one.
Since we're all here, I just want to note that it took Creative Commons like 15 years to get away from jurisdiction-specific solutions. The current CC licenses are not jurisdiction-specific, and like all the learning, the processing, et cetera, through those years led us to a non-jurisdiction-specific solution.
Okay.
I think we exhausted the queue, maybe time.
Yeah, it's time for a break. Let's come back at 5 after the hour, maybe 15 minutes.
And
okay.
Ted, if you want to start taking notes for this, like we can try to find somebody else after the break. Thank you. Fars and Joe, you're really good. Yari too. If you can do like the last hour or so.
That'll be short.
Good.
And Eric too. Eric is kind of looking at his phone.
Oh yeah, Eric's here.
Yeah, I'm reacting.
Okay, 15 minutes.
I mean, I think part of what triggers is where
How do you want to do it?
territorial choices like the EU make any sort of decisions that the US on how
Can
they
do it.
interpret these services.
But I like the.
And so we as a group may say, well,
I suspect this has run out of battery. Oh, that's annoying. Yeah.
Is there a different?
No, oh no. Hold on, I have a cord somewhere.
Are
those things?
I make the choice, but I make the choice in this interpretation of what it's going to be. Because we're not in this exercise in the assigning semantic meaning.
I had a cord somewhere.
Can I kick you out, Mark? So, but the meeting ends. Kick you out.
No, you can't. Don't do that. Yeah.
I have a cord for this down the road, and then no legal regimes will look at it and say, oh, in my territory, yes, in that field, because right. And so it is encouraging that people would say, oh, well, if that's what you can interpret, I'm going to say it's only be choice for that.
All right, well, we're just gonna have to let it run. And oh wait, that's the cord. That's the cord. Lovely. So plug that into a USB port.
I need to know if that's a charger or a.
So now it's charging. So I turn that on. It might have the charger. Oh no! Yeah.
From
Can you hear us?
server development perspective.
People remote?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Thanks, Brian. Are we just like slowly gathering back after the break? Just like unmuted.
That's like I think perhaps so here's the question.
It looks like the like
It's upside down. Is that the same?
No, it's not just upside down. The labels are wrong.
Sure.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, let's close the doors.
Can you close the door? I would think so. And you take one right snippet of the subordinate to that, right?
I take the notes, please. Are you please taking the notes?
Okay, remote folks, can you hear us?
Yeah. Brian already stuff on there.
Oh, no. Okay. Let's get started again. Miriam?
Miriam?
We've got 15 minutes left. We don't necessarily have to use all that time. I wanted to quickly go over, before we stop, Sarah mentioned this idea of that we've talked about a couple times now, about kind of guidelines on how to use this framework for interested folks such as regulators, that it's not a complete system. And I have a bit of a laundry list of different aspects of that that we might touch upon in such a document or section of a document or wherever it ends up. I just want to go over that really quickly, and if that doesn't capture anything, or if people disagree violently with a part of the list, we can talk about that quickly. But just to cover that, and that should just take a few minutes. So the things I've got so far are the aspects of opt-in versus opt-out and how that relates to the framework. The robots time dimension that we talked about, the robots.txt and the timing of the application of that preference.
Sorry, what's the list for which document?
Well, where this ends up is TBD.
Okay.
Yeah. Reconciling disparate assertions from multiple sources. As we discussed, we talked about reconciling when you get different assertions from the same or different preferences from the same source, but once you have multiple sources for a particular piece of data, we don't say anything about that. Dealing with hosted content. So for example, in social media, where the end user might not have the ability to set a policy depending on the capability given to them. Identifying rights holders, authentication, that sort of stuff. Exceptions for good uses like accessibility, academic, research, that sort of thing. Data protection and privacy. And finally, any kind of enforcement or audit mechanism. Does anything else immediately pop to mind for anybody that we can get on that list? Yes.
Can I change exceptions to impact on?
Sure. Impact upon those, yeah. And anything else? I'm sure this list will grow. I mean, I know I've already lost a number of things that have popped up in discussion at various points, but I thought it'd just be good to start keeping that list so we have the kernel of the document. Yes, sir.
The list, could you screen share it?
I can't screen share it because data tracker only allows me to log in at one place.
Can you throw it in the notes?
I can put it in the chat.
Can you put the link to the notes in the chat?
Yeah. Oh, and Brian said about RSS. Yes, we could do an extension for Atom. I would love to do that as the editor of Atom.
You are?
Yes.
What are you not editing?
That's a good question. The stuff that he edits.
Quick. Quick. Sorry.
Say again, what's the title of the list?
Oh, this is just guidelines.
Think about
yeah.
How we communicate, because it's about understanding the limitations of what it is.
Right, because we're not producing a complete solution.
It looks like almost, I think it's almost two different lists, like things that we that are conditions around this thing. Like for example, opt-in, opt-out is something that we obviously think a great deal about, that this needs to be somehow explained how that works, versus rights holder identification is another thing, is like, we will not go there in a million years because that
million years is a long time, but yeah.
Okay, but like.
Till August.
It belongs on a different list for me than opt-in versus
Right.
opt-out.
Sure.
I think of this as you know, if I'm a regulator who wants to, you know, reference the product of this work, what things do I need to consider that may not be obvious? You know, we're not going to give them much guidance about, you know, the impact on other good uses, for example. But we want to be clear about what we're providing to them.
There's sort of like a type of things like I think enforcement audit is known limitations or like that's sort of like things that we need to communicate that are sort of out of scope.
Mm-hmm.
And regulators need to be aware that this system is not offering any sort of meaningful solutions for those parts of the puzzle. Versus other things are like I think the things like the time dimension and opt-out, opt-in is something where we need to sort of explain features of the system, how that interact.
Exactly.
Those are the two different types I see.
We'll develop this over time. I think you're right. Yeah.
So I think to a large extent, this list is good, and I would probably lean toward putting it in the vocabulary document at some level. That's not to say that we would say produce solutions, but to say here's the vocabulary that we're producing. Here's how we imagine it might be used, and therefore, under those assumptions, these are the sorts of things that you're probably not going to get as a result of that. So
Right.
talk about this as an applicability,
Kind of, yeah.
understanding,
Yeah.
you know, what it is that we're providing more than the technical pieces. Because some of these pieces imply potentially a lot of extra work in order to address. And that's not at all what the point of this list is.
No, it's not. Yeah.
It's all about saying, if you're going to use this,
Be aware.
be aware that this is what you're getting and this is what you're not getting.
Right. And in chat, Ted said that this looks like an applicability statement. I absolutely agree. That's an IETF term. And as Ted says, it can be a separate document or it can be in document. This could very well be an appendix on the vocabulary.
I would suggest that if we're doing it right, we have an applicability statement in that document. It may not be complete in the sense that it goes into all of the details and the nuance, but I think if we're doing it right, we've got something that's pretty solid as a core thing that allows you to understand the basics, maybe not all of the details and extrapolations that come from that. Maybe we don't talk about rights holder identification. We just talk about the notion of this declaring party that all use and what that means.
Yeah, I do have a slightly different opinion. I'll wait for Sarah to go and then I have different opinion.
I think probably including like bot identification and authentication in there. I don't think it's already covered.
Sure.
And then maybe also changing the language around other good uses. I'm not sure if what's meant there is like legally accepted use cases. So things like academic research having an exception, in which case I think it's more in the like opt-in, opt-out section, or if it's just please don't ruin these things, which is a separate.
I think it's more just pointing out that. Well, and maybe this is something we don't need to say to regulators, but it's not authoritative. You know, it's not that.
Yeah.
It's always applied one-to-one.
I think there's a very simple statement you make here, which is that a legal regime may overrule anything in here.
In both directions.
In both directions.
Yeah.
Saying certain things are not permitted under, and this has no bearing.
But wasn't part of that, like I think where this good uses language came from was also this idea that if you go higher up in the sort of buckets of doing an opt-out, TDM opt-out, that this carries the risk of sort of affecting good uses like spam filtering, etc. So like that's maybe not a statement of applicability to legislators, but like that there's trade-offs to be made by people using this vocabulary. If they go too broad, they may shoot themselves into their own foot.
That's a good point. Because that is less obvious than I think, you know, academic and
It was this accessibility. Like accessibility is probably something which is also like there's probably rules around accessibility, but like
there may not be rules about
spam filtering or
yeah.
And maybe there needs to be, but that's not our business.
Yeah.
Should I interject myself here or wait?
I'm waiting to say something too. Yeah. So the point I want to make is like I'm kind of not for a adding this into the vocabulary document, because there might be guidelines we want to do for the applicability for the attachments too, or how to combine them too. It's part of like what Mark talked about. And the second reason is that like this might evolve further after we publish our vocabulary stuff, right? Like we might get more feedback from people who use it, and we kind of want to reflect it to show that there's like some different things we have thought about and like maybe some clarifications we need to do. I would certainly like to keep it in a separate document if possible, but like not totally set on it, but I really don't think we would have all the material for this done at the same time as the vocabulary document gets started.
Perhaps we could start it in a separate document and then make a judgment call down the road.
Makes sense. That works.
Robot. So I'm not familiar at this point as far as IETF goes, but as far as like implementation guidelines, and people kind of talked about this some, but like showing users like an example, if you do this, here's the impact, right? And so like if someone says TDM no, search yes, that has a lot of impact that's not immediately visible, right? With just those two statements, you know, and like some explanation kind of about what that might mean, you know, to the user to give kind of give further guidance for effective use. Like, does the IETF have like generally do anything like that, or would that be fall purely kind of outside the IETF?
So generally, I'm speaking in very general terms.
Sure.
The IETF tends to shy away from putting user guides in specifications. It's not a hard and fast rule, but that's at least what I've observed. That's not to say that because they tend to need to evolve, and I'm very conscious that we're kind of applying different criteria here. But usually we find that those sorts of materials spring up more spontaneously in the community. And they're, you know, like for example, for the web, we've got the Mozilla web developer stuff, and that seems to be adequate. I think we're kind of treating regulators as a very different audience here, and considering them differently because it is, you know, a much rougher interface. There's much less incentive for the information to flow freely there. Having said that, it's like I said, it's not a hard and fast rule. We can certainly create materials like that if we think it's the right thing to do, and depending on our resources.
I guess it would be covered by the vocabulary to some extent, in terms of what we would mean by TDM in the first place.
So if you can speak up.
Oh.
I heard you, but if you can speak up, I think.
Oh, I just said, I guess it would be covered by the vocabulary.
Right. Like depending on the audience, you know, our specifications should be self-explanatory. The problem is that for wider audiences, they often aren't.
Joe?
I think it's definitely worth having some kind of note, and what format and how formal that is, and whether it's written down in the RFC or somewhere else. You know, people in the IETF are going to have to communicate that. But there appears to be the narrative, which is wider stakeholders ask for like a TDM opt-out. What does that look like? We've been discussing a lot in the last 36 hours that the TDM opt-outs are a really crazy thing on some levels, because then there's all these important things that depend on TDM you're not considered. But you've asked for one, so here it is. It has the word TDM in it, because it would be kind of silly if it didn't, and we discovered that, I think, on day one. But you also want to consider actually changing what was originally legislated as a TDM opt-outs to being Gen AI and then training opt-out to whatever. The actual words that we use and like how the vocabulary ends up being, obviously, all subject to change. But I think reasonable putting a note in somewhere to the people who are reading this. Legislating for a TDM opt-out gives people the chance to accidentally opt out of lots of things they probably appreciate there being involved. And that would be a useful contribution to the work.
That's good. Thank you. Ted?
So I wanted to go back to a statement Fabrice made earlier, that people get themselves into silly states at the moment because they're using one tool in one way and a different tool to say something else. And I think when I was listening to Timid Robot's request here, I was thinking about it in terms of the combinations document, where we have to be able to explain how you combine different signals. And I think in that instance, in particular, we actually do need to be relatively explicit about how the combination signals work both in the case where they're coming from two different sources, but especially in the case where you're building out a statement that may have unintended effects if you don't understand what the combination means. So I agree that we don't do user guides, but I think this is actually an exploration of the relation between semantics and syntax. And I think we do that. And I think we need to do that in this case for the people who build tools for like content management systems or other things that want to automate this for people. They won't do the right way. So I think there's an implementation community here that's not handcrafting this, that really does need to know how the combination stuff will play out in terms of the end state for the preference for any particular resource. So I think this does deserve some significant work. It might not be by August, but I would say that it would be a very useful target for an early document in the post-August reach out.
Thank you.
And I think a quick note that I fully agree, but I think we need to know our semantics by August. So
yeah,
some of that needs to be.
Yeah. And now let's wander through Garden of Bright Images and show you what it means in this particular corner, and that might be after August. The semantics. Agreed.
Mark, like FARS had this statement saying it's just like mainly targeted towards regulators or like all sort of authoritative parties. I would say all, right? Or
I can imagine it's useful information for many people, but you know that's the kind of core scope of the document.
Cool. Thanks. Oh,
All that makes sense. I just want to warn, like, we are defaulting into like a very engineering specific view of the world here, which goes like, we need to provide perfect systems to express complex things, and we want people to be aware of their actions. Let me just make the case what most people on the other side of this thing look at opt-outs at the moment. And opt-out is intended as a signal to say, I want to force you to license my content to train your AI model. Like, to some degree, there is an expectation for many rights holders that there is an entitlement, that people should pay them for the use of their things. And the best thing that they have at the moment is to say no via opt-out. Like, there's a huge mismatch between these things. But if we're building a system where the answer to this, you want to say no, please read a manual, be careful in considering what the 15 unintended consequences are, you are losing these people. Like, to some degree, like, this also needs to work just on the thing. Somebody wants to say no and wants to open a licensing conversation with a company that is interested in using their content. That is sort of, we need to, and this group has the natural tendency to go in the other. We want to build perfectly interpretable sort of systems that can be parsed and that give us like an outcome that is clear, that ends up with a yes/no bid. They want to see a licensing agreement. The majority of the professional writers, and we don't have like the guys and publishers in the room today, but like that is the reality we also.
I want to respond to that very quickly. I think this group has actually come a long way and away from perfect, which is very, very good to see. I'm very happy with that. I think the spirit here is more that we are creating something that has a fair amount of nuance and severe limitations. And I think, at least for me, I feel compelled at least to try to communicate that. If no one listens, that's fine. But let's at least try and write it down.
Fabrice?
I want to build on what I just heard from Paul, because it's exactly what's happened at Microsoft, and I did the fight to have only 3 options. Today this is the no cache, no archive, and default thing. Because I can assure you that the engineering team and some of myself that I was pushing back came up with crazy list of options, kind of the hierarchy things, and LLM, yes, no, and craziness. And no, I came up with only 3 options, listening to publisher about, yes, this is get me out of there. This kind of complete opt-out from LLM trainings and things like this, and display. And oh, I want to be in display. that I want to be linked, but still no LLM, and okay, you can do whatever you like. It's kind of a three option, and I think we should be avoiding too much hierarchy, too much complex things, and maybe simple names that people will understand and relate to their laws and business.
Sonia?
Yeah, just to comment on Paul's observation around the incentive being licensing. I think it is for some rights holders. I think other rights holders do want to be out of training. And I think because of that, we need to be able to understand exactly how we should action these signals. And so communicating that to all stakeholders is really important. So I think having some
specificity.
Yeah, thank you. Having that would be really helpful.
My point was also not against specificity, but more your point, like it also needs to work for, like it also needs to be work for people who are set in a very simple yes, no mindset. Right? I guess. Yeah.
Wait, done for you?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Timid Robot?
There's Timid Robot. I just want to observe, Fabrice, that you're representing, like there's three options, but if there's already some filtering in that it's just Microsoft looking at those three options. And so when you factor in other entities besides Microsoft, there's already a level of complexity there that, you know, that the vocabulary system needs to include. And then I forgot the second point, so that's quick. Thank you.
Agree, we can't make it worse, or at least shouldn't make it significantly worse for those people who just want to say yes and no.
Sure. I want to reply quickly based on this is Tim, but I think yes, I can assure you at Microsoft there was a variety of options that came up about what we should do, not do. We were interviewing people, and this was a huge landscape across the board. But at the end is we were listening really to publishers, and somehow we satisfy publishers, and the level of complaints went to zero, near zero. But hey, yes, you are listening to me, and we somehow respect you. Okay, good. We will come up with a new standard in the future. Great. For now, it's good enough. And this is maybe this MVP is again the next steps of good enough for the whole industry with limited vocabulary, but will be satisfying cannabis publisher that, as you said, want to be pushing back and no access to data until you pay me, or this access will be limited to search maybe, and this is good enough for now until we extend the vocabulary in the future.
Thank you. Okay, Paul.
I just want to observe, I don't think it is particularly an accident that Microsoft comes up with three options. I look what AI does, like they have three different sort of flags, like our proposal, and they don't necessarily match, but our proposal, the draft that I put in had three sort of like categories that points to some kind of like level of complexity that we shouldn't go very far beyond, because it becomes hard to process. Like a lot of the criticism that comes towards this sort of like how the regulatory environment is like, we don't know how to deal with this. Like we don't, sort of people who are suddenly put in a situation where a regulatory context requires them to make explicit choices, like bulk at the fact that they need to make choices in the first place, and sort of like them, there's a difference between giving them a menu with three options and a menu with like 10 options and some options.
Thank you. Mark?
So listening to this discussion and then mapping it back to the last couple of days, you know, we expressed interest in talking about search and the search use cases, and we expressed interest in talking about inference and related use cases. And already in that discussion, we heard that there was a lot of different, you know, optionality in each of those cases, and you might need, you know, finer grained vocabulary. But this, you know, discussion is making me think personally, if we do those things in this first iteration of what we do, they should be quite coarse-grained. And maybe we add a search bump, and maybe we add an inference time bump, and that's as far as we go. and further refinements might come down the road. Because just getting those two on is going to be hard enough, I think.
But that tracks with what we had in the discussion yesterday, so it's coming the same result from a different.
And that makes me happy as a chair. Yeah. So it seems like that discussion has concluded. We've got 25 minutes left. If somebody has something that they think we can use that time productively discussing, we can do that. Otherwise, we can break early. And Mary has to go.
Mary,
So now this thing is over anyway.
Trains are going to be late anyway.
Yeah. Anyone have anything?
I just put it out there that I put the crawler code of conduct draft on the list. If someone wants to pick it up and run with it, that would be great because I cannot be the lead on it for affiliation reasons. And I think it would be something nice to have in general, because there are new crawlers coming up, and I know for certain, having talked to them, or some of them at least, that they don't know how to behave on the internet. And like if they have some guidelines, then that would be good.
Yeah.
But again, like the two of us cannot do it. Like we cannot put that out ourselves.
Even with your immense power.
No, as in.
I know. I know how.
So how are we supposed to run, how can we run with it?
Make a copy paste.
It's not something this working group has in charter, but it's if folks are interested in organizing a separate effort, that's entirely appropriate. And that could be an IETF effort. It could be just a casual industry effort. It could be somewhere else. And I guess in related news, I forget if this was announced in the list yet, but if not, I'll put it on the list. There is now a separate IETF mailing list, not official working group or anything, but just a mailing list to discuss bot authentication on the web. So the idea that non-human agents crawling or accessing the human-oriented web, and what is needed to move away from identifying them via the user agent or the IP address or reverse DNS, all which are highly problematic, moving from that to cryptographic authentication.
I think this is great. Where do we find this?
It's mailing list. I'll send a link to the list because it's related to the discussions.
They have a timeline, and how do we anticipate dealing with like
There is no they. It's just a mailing list. So it doesn't have a charter. It doesn't have
Tomorrow.
I started it. Sorry.
Okay.
But
because there's a risk here that.
Well,
sorry, no.
right now it's an industry discussion, and there is very heavy interest in this topic. I think it's very important for a lot of actors. So I wouldn't be surprised if there were more formal proposals soon. But we're not quite at that stage yet.
But there are like very good ideas already.
Yeah.
That, because a lot of the conversation on day one will then feed into this, right? Which is, does there need to be an inference bucket? Is that what you're anticipating, like that this group will pick up some of that work?
No, this is more about for those situations where you do want to condition your behavior on the identity of who's asking.
Yeah, absolutely.
You would be able to do so with far more assurance than you currently have.
Right.
But I might want to do that from all the, like from an AIPREF point of view, as we've been discussing here as well. So
I think it's kind of orthogonal, right? Like, whether you express a preference for something and how you verify they are who they are. Right. I think that's kind of the difference.
Right.
So I guess different people.
You express a preference to say like, hey, like I want these kind of people to not show up, but then you just verifying whether those kind of people are who they say they are, right? Like,
So it could be an authentication system that would then paint preferences. Okay.
Right. So this is just an authentication mechanism, though. It does not authorization. What you do with that data is a separate task.
Yeah.
It could be you block someone. It could be that you send a different response. A number of things. Oh, we'll talk. So that just in the spirit of announcements, I guess. Yeah. Anything else? Okay.
Just one thing. I think there is a hot topic. This is also the crawl load on the internet. 75% of visits on the internet are from bots, from fake bots to to real bots, good bots. And I do believe this is something that is really need to be looked at as an industry, IETF or something, to minimize the footprint that is generating a lot of CO2. We somehow have the responsibility of some of this, but we see other actors really bad at coal efficiency and are triggering a lot of load on the internet, costing the whole industry billions of dollars every day, generating a lot of CO2, and this is something that we want to help resolving. Some of this is via protocol, sitemaps and XNO and others, but yeah, there is a fundamentally real problem for the industry today.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. And there are already IETF interest areas and programs talking about environmental impact that might be interesting to take to them in the first instance.
Yes.
Thank you. And I would like to thank Fabrice
Yes.
and Microsoft
Yes.
for like
Yes.
generating
Thank you.
the space and like the nice lunches and everything. And thanks to everybody who took the notes, like Eric, Ted, Yari, Fars, Joe, and anybody else I missed. So thank you very much for taking the notes. We couldn't do this without you. And like you won't save this for the future if you don't have those notes. So thank you.
And thank you to the chairs for keeping us focused on our topic.
Well, attempting to, at least.
No, good job. We got through big topics. And we're doing it.
Well,
and it feels like we made progress.
I feel like we made progress, yeah. But thank you again, Fabrice and Microsoft. That was okay. Well, like I said, we'll announce future meetings. We'll see activity on the mailing list and on GitHub. Yeah, hopefully we'll see folks in various ways soon. Oh, yeah, good point. Mike, did you have anything else to add, if you're still with us?
Yeah, I'm still here. Just thanks everyone for good progress, and it's nice to see this work getting off to a good start.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you soon. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Should I reserve the room for the whole week of 14th, or just a weekend?
It would be I think Thursday, Friday. I think if we do it then there it would be Thursday, Friday.
Because I just put a whole week and then I got the others. So.
Oh, okay, fair enough.
Hey, look. Hello. Look at the mouse. So the mouse looks like this, right?
Yeah,
this should be the left button.
That should be left button. It is left button.
But I can share.
You're holding it upside down. That's where it's at.
I understand, but if I hold it like this, it should be the left button.
That's you were holding it upside down, maybe this is yeah. Because that's the problem. Is the most natural place to come is like that. No.
Exactly. Yeah. No, the button on the right is the left button, and it doesn't tap. It doesn't tap.
That's the left button.
I understand.
Yeah.
No, but if I hold the mouse like this, right?
Right.
So
but that's not how it's designed to be held.
I know. I understand.
Yeah. So,